In today's episode of Today in World War II, March 30th, the French have another cowardly proposal to how to fight the war against the Germans. Speaking of the Germans, Hitler holds a conference and tells his generals that the war in the East is going to be a race war. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Command takes over the all the theaters of war against the Japanese in the Pacific. The RAF conducts another very expensive raid against the Germans, this time in Nuremberg. The U.S. Fast carriers obliterate Japanese bases and naval forces in the Caroline Islands. And finally, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, marches into Danzig and takes a bunch of prisoners. Let's get started. All right, let's talk about the French again. March 30th, 1940. Another cowardly, just pathetic reaction to the fact that they're still fighting a war here, but they're doing nothing and they're so afraid of doing anything. You're in a war and you're worried about possibly, I don't know, insulting the enemy, I guess. In this case, French Minister of Defense Daladier, he persuaded the French War Committee to not ratify the British proposal to lay mines in the Rhine River. Um, so you have a very important waterway that military supplies, military, troops, ammunition, all this stuff is being ferried on, and you're too afraid to put mines on it in a country that you're at war with, right? I don't know how I mean, the Brits weren't much better, but they were better than the French when it came to that stuff before the Germans attacked. The Brits responded by threatening to abandon any plans that they had to mine the Norwegian waters. So it's okay to okay. So let me understand this logic. So it's perfectly okay to mine a neutral country's waters, but it's not okay to mine the waters of the country you're at war with. Makes sense. Absolutely makes sense. All right, March 30th, 1941, Hitler holds a conference with his generals specifically about the upcoming war in the Soviet Union. And he stated that above all else, this war will be a race war. And who's on the target list? Any kind of communist commissars, Jews, of course, will be immediately exterminated by the Einsatzgruppen that's going to be following behind the army. And he also said this very famously, and this is really the reason why he lost the war before it even started, because he said that the Soviet Union would be defeated in a matter of weeks. And he said this famous quote, "We only have to kick the door down and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Well, that's what happens when you have a Aryan viewpoint of the world where you think anyone below you, especially Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, I could go on and on. The list was pretty long, but we're talking about the Slavs in this case. Anybody in Eastern Europe, pretty much, except the Hungarians and the Romanians, they were Slavs. Polish, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Belarus, Russians, Yugoslavians, except for the Bosnians, they're all Slavs, right? So if you think they're subhuman, then you're going to underestimate their capabilities. Well, you know, he didn't read history very well. I don't think Napoleon thought that they were subhuman and that the Russians would not resist. And of course they did. But, it was insane to go after the Soviet Union to begin with. On March 30th, 1942, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Command decided that they were going to assume full control and responsibility for all the Allied forces in the Pacific, and rightly so, because we were going to be doing the majority of the fighting there. So they divided the theaters into separate commands. So they had the Southwest Pacific Ocean area that was under MacArthur. They gave Nimitz, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Ocean area, the central, and I think that the General Wavell, I believe at this time, he was in charge of the Burma, Indonesia, Indian side, which was really kind of a backwater for the most part. So yeah, now it's interesting they did not give They neither gave Nimitz nor MacArthur full control of the theater, which I think meant they didn't really trust MacArthur, you know, and I understand that, but I think that if you look at the casualty rates that were had under MacArthur, it was by far less than what the Marines took, for example, in the Central Pacific campaign. So, look, listen, MacArthur had his faults, just like Patton had his faults, but they certainly were geniuses. And listen, you can't criticize Nimitz. Nimitz did an amazing job, and you can't fault him. I think that perhaps there were some mistakes made, like in Palau, for example. They didn't need to invade the Palau Islands. They could have bypassed a little bit more, possibly, not sure. But who am I? I'm just some guy doing a video blog about World War II. So on March 30th, 1944, RAF sends out another very strong raid against this time Nuremberg. They sent 82 they sent about 572 Lancasters, 214 Halifax bombers. They had 9 Mosquito bombers as pathfinders, and they lost 82 aircraft on the way, and 12 they lost on the return flight. So you look at the air crew, they lost about 700 air crew. If you combine that with the raid on Berlin that happened just a couple days ago that we talked about, a few days ago in this video chronicle, that's a lot of air crew. Lots of air crew. They lost in the space of a week, they lost almost 2,000 air crew. So if you think about that, that is a significant loss. And it shows you that night bombing wasn't all that safe either. And on March 30th, 1944, Admiral Spruance, Fifth Fleet, decided to go into the Caroline Islands in the Central Pacific, and Operation Desecrate completely desecrated the Japanese. They they spent 2 days striking all of the shipping, the fleet servicing facilities, and other locations in Palau, Yap, Ulithi, Wolier, and the Caroline Islands, and they sank a poop load of vessels. I tell you what, I can tell you this, that there was never such a powerful naval force in the history of mankind than the fast carrier task force in World War II in the Pacific. They were unstoppable. It was ironic that there was very little damage done to the carriers in by the Japanese conventionally. They started taking a toll with kamikazes. Only suicide attacks could even put a dent in that carrier task force, but it didn't stop them. So just crazy. Finally, on March 30th, 1945, Soviet troops marched into Danzig, the very famous port that was the object of all of the pre-World War II controversy when Hitler was demanding Danzig to come back to Germany, and there was a Danzig corridor, if you remember your history. Well, 6 years later, 5.5 years later, Soviet troops marched into Danzig, took 10,000 prisoners of war, and they captured 45 submarines. So the Soviets were repeating the 1940 Ardennes offensive over and over again. They would encircle, cut them off, you know, and have their backs to the sea. And although the Germans in the Baltic areas and in East Prussia, they were able to do some pretty significant evacuation. The Germans estimate they evacuated around 2 million people, but there was no England to go to, like the Brits could go to England, and this is a safe haven. The Germans had no safe haven from the Soviets, so that's why they lost, right? Well, thank you for watching this video. I appreciate it, and I will see you tomorrow.